extra money. Don't get me started.
I'm gonna get a mug.
Brought the original.
How are you doing?
I need Peter Weather, Scott Winchip, and Adam White. That's it.
Get it done.
We've been working, dude.
Get it done.
It'll be a great sweep when I finish all of it.
Adam White's in like a bunker. Made it very hard to get to him. I don't know.
I've seen emails on You guys know what's gracious enough to talk about this. We'll see. I think Scott Parkinson is coming.
Godspeed to you.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
I thought of like the craziest thing there, and I just guessed it. And that was that actually it? I know, but we're good at guessing.
Well. Look at the cat dragon.
Good. Woke up, went for a run. You're not here as well. Where's your you guys doing shit? I think it's pretty slow right now.
We're going on research.
Oh wow, so you like England. When did you start up? Oh, so, I couldn't remember when we don't start school until October, so yeah, you used to start school when you graduated. That's cool. Oh, nice. That's awesome. Are you guys doing like
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's really cool. I know. Yeah. Yeah. Aside from that part, was she? No, when did she left out. She was always.
folks can just find a seat, come in out of the hall, we'll get started here in just a minute or so. Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Neil Bradley. I am the Chief Strategy Officer at the Conservative Reform Network, and I'm deeply grateful that all of you have taken the time to join us this afternoon for the launch of Room to Grow a series. This is an initiative and a project that we're excited about and very proud of, and I think over the next hour or so you'll see why, and hopefully you'll be as excited about it as we are. Before I get started, we're going to hear from a number of our authors today and our editors who will be part of the two panel discussions that we're going to have. We also have a number of other authors of the 19 chapters who are here in attendance, and I want to recognize them briefly. Andrew Kelly and Vikrant Reddy, Ryan Ellis, Grace Marie Turner, and I think I just saw Scott Winship sneak in the door somewhere. So you all will be seeing their chapters come out over the rest of the summer and over the course of the fall, and I can give you a little sneak preview to tell you that they're just as exciting as the 3 books we're releasing today on startups, higher education, and the environment and energy. Just a quick note about the schedule. We're going to start today with a panel discussion on the first book of the series on startups and entrepreneurship. That panel is going to be moderated by Raihan Salam, who, for those of you who watch CNN or frankly a lot of other cable channels, he'll be no stranger to you, and we'll hear from Jim, the author of the chapter, and others. Then we'll hear from Senate Majority Whip John Cornyn for brief remarks on entrepreneurship. I expect he may also take questions, so if you have some pressing questions for Senator Cornyn, begin thinking about those. Then we'll have a panel on the overall Room to Grow project with brief discussions of the 2 other books we're releasing today on higher education and the environment. And we'll conclude with remarks from Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy, who I also expect will take a few questions. So before we dive into the meat of it with our first panel, let me say a few thank yous. First to Google for hosting us today, and Susan Molinari and Seth Webb and their team here. You all have been tremendous to work with, and I think we can all agree it's a pretty exciting place to be, and it's a lot better than the drab conference rooms of Rayburn, so thank you. Second, to the Bradley Foundation. No relation. I wish they were. But thank you for your support of this initiative. Without you, frankly, the Room to Grow series wouldn't be possible. And finally, a special thank you to April Panuru. I think most of you probably know April. April, raise your hand. Don't hide in the back. There we go. Well deserved. Let me just say, without April, Room to Grow 1 never would have occurred, and Room to Grow a series would be some random ideas on a sheet of paper. And because of her efforts, we have all that we're unveiling today and will unveil. And so the credit for all of this goes to April. Without further ado, Raihan and our first panel. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. This panel is occasioned by Jim Pethokoukis' wonderful new pamphlet, wonderful new brief on entrepreneurship, startups and entrepreneurship, and how they relate to economic growth. The Conservative Reform Network is devoted to the idea of applying conservative principles to the aching need for reforming aging, failing institutions in US society. And this is one domain where we need a lot of help, according to Jim. Jim, there's a phrase that you often like to use. It's one of my favorites. And first let me introduce Jim Pethokoukis. Jim Pethokoukis is a columnist and blogger at the American Enterprise Institute. Kristen Soltis Anderson is a co-founder of Echelon Insights and the author of The Selfie Vote. Pete Snyder is the CEO of Disruptor Capital and himself a serial entrepreneur. So we've got a couple of entrepreneurs, and we've got Jim, who is a kind of entrepreneur of the mind, among many other things. But okay.
That is excellent.
I want to get to a really burning question is, why should we worry about this stuff at all, Jim? We have so many startups. Everyone and their aunt is starting a business. These two jokers have started businesses. I mean, surely there's no problem with startups. Surely there's no need to do anything at all.
Right, and indeed, when I've given versions of this paper and these ideas, and I've talked to people who are in Silicon Valley, they're like, "What are you talking about?" I mean, just pick up the newspaper. There's just all about new startups, new financing rounds, story after story about unicorns, these sort of billion-dollar startups, and America has way more than any other country, which is great. That is actually fantastic news, because throughout American history, that has been sort of the deep magic of our economy, to be able to create fast-growing new companies, which are going to supply the new goods and services, and hopefully lots of good-paying jobs. And that is the really strength. I mean, when people talk about American exceptionalism, I hope that is one of the things they mean, that we have this very vibrant, dynamic, free enterprise
Okay, so I guess
system.
the panel's over because everything's working.
That's good.
Okay,
good,
cool.
good to go. But it's weird, because while you have that impression from Silicon Valley and people who are inside the tech industry, the sort of broader macro statistics paint a different story. That shows that the startup rate in this country, which is how many businesses are sort of new businesses, that's way down. We're sort of losing more businesses than we're creating. The size of these companies, number of fast-growing companies overall seems to be down. It's been sort of a 30-year trend. Now, perhaps coincidentally, perhaps not, that 30-year trend has coincided with basically a 30-year lull in U.S. productivity growth. And why do we care about productivity? You may have heard a few presidential candidates talk about growth targets. We want to grow 4% in the future. Maybe some like to grow 5% or 6%. Well, that's going to be super hard. Back in 2013, the White House put out a report saying very clearly the U.S. will grow more slowly in the future than in the past. And why is that? Well, a big reason is because we have slowing labor force growth, because we're getting older, all the baby boomers are retiring. But also part of the reason is U.S. productivity growth, which is the other half of that equation, has just not been very strong for a long time, other than a 10-year period in the late 90s, early 2000s. So if we want fast growth in the future, if we want to just grow as fast in the future as in the past, much less 4% or 5%, we need to become more productive. And what drives productivity in this country is innovation. And startups are the fountain of innovation. So even if it's not a crisis in that, if we were generating no unicorns, that would be a crisis. We have to do better in the future. We may not have a great stagnation, but what we need is sort of a great optimization. I mean, we need to have smarter tax, regulatory, education, immigration policy, so we create even more productivity, innovation, startups in the future.
So Pete, walk me through this. I mean, you're someone who invests in promising entrepreneurs. You started new companies yourself. And what I want to know is this. I mean, why can't you just have old incumbent firms generating the new ideas? You used to have Bell Labs in previous eras, and they generated tons of valuable new technologies. Why is it that new enterprises are the ones that are introducing new business models? What's the necessary connection there?
Well, I think it's all about the market economy, right? I mean, you can't have, I guess you could have, and if you look at countries where you have a handful of companies, that you look at countries that still have yet to privatize, that are in charge of steel, that are in charge of copper, that are in charge of electricity, and what kind of service their customers get, right? If you have monopolies in certain industries, it's going to be a bad thing for customers. It's going to be a bad thing for innovation. So, that's why I just completely reject the whole idea of too big to fail. Why should our government continue to prop up players that can't make it on their own? I would absolutely love to see the companies that could step in and fill the gap when others go under.
Would you say there's also a cultural dimension to it? That is, would you say that in a kind of older company, you just kind of have a kind of stodginess, kind of a kind of, an unwillingness to do things in different ways, whereas a new company has greater willingness, or
Sure,
is that just a myth?
But it's not one size fits all. I mean, look at HP. HP has gone through amazing innovation cycles in their life, and they've been stagnant at other times. Right now, they seem to be on the rebound. So you can have companies that have been around for 60, 70, 80, 100 years that continue to innovate, but it is a wonderful thing. Competition is a wonderful thing in almost every industry out there to keep the ideas flowing.
Kristen, one of the factors that Jim identifies is demographic change. Simply put, if you have, slowing population growth, given that it tends to be not the youngest people, but youngish people who are the ones starting businesses. Tell me a little bit about the rising generation you write about in the Selfie Vote and their attitudes towards entrepreneurship.
So Jim notes in his chapter that the sort of prime time to be an entrepreneur is that early to mid-career stage rather than sort of late in your career. And one of the challenges is that right now the millennial generation, people born in the 80s and 90s, are very, they want to be very entrepreneurial. They're very entrepreneurial in ambition, but not necessarily in behavior. I think it's something like 3.6% of startups or small businesses are owned by someone under the age of 30. For the most part, small businesses are not really a young man's game in America these days. And that's in part because while a lot of young people do want to start their own business, they do look at someone like a Mark Zuckerberg as the model for what they might like to do. They have come of age in an era where a lot of the things they were told were the responsible things to do wound up seeming a lot riskier than they may have expected. They saw their parents' 401ks evaporate. They saw the job market just crater as they were graduating. They saw home values tank. They saw the foreclosure signs going up on the street where they grew up. And so all of these things that they had been told were the responsible things to do in terms of their personal finance turned out to be really risky. And so while at the same time that they are an entrepreneurial generation in maybe temperament, in behavior, they're actually very small c conservative in their personal finance. And that risk aversion has meant that you actually don't have as many young people starting up businesses as the polling data would suggest you might, given that you have something like 2/3 of young people that say they want to start businesses, particularly young Hispanics and young African Americans.
Well, on the other hand, isn't one of the neat things about entrepreneurship, at least in the kind of new economy space, that in a way the barriers to entry are lower now than they have been in the past? So what do you think about that, Jim? I mean,
That's what makes it all sort of surprising that you see these statistics that startups overall. And by the way, I'm sure using startups sort of generally, and there's more than one kind. There's sort of your classic sort of I'm going to start a business because that would be a good income. I can hire my family. I have my goal is not to become Google.
It's like a self-employed kind
right.
of, yeah.
And and those are super important. In fact, and one of the things that seems to be suppressing that are these occupational licensing regulations. And the White House just put out a report today on that. I don't know what it said, but hopefully it argued strongly that against those. But what the chapter is really more about is what I would call sort of your high impact startups, the ones which hopefully are on the trajectory to become another Google or Apple computer, that are really going to be highly innovative, that are really hopefully going to hire a lot of people, they're going to generate a lot of economic activity. So those are sort of the ones I'm focusing on. Those are those are important. We're getting back to sort of competition. And you mentioned briefly, I think my favorite phrase, which is I asked the head of McKinsey Global Institute one time, what is the number one thing that's responsible for fast economic growth? And she said, maximum competitive intensity, which is a great sort of consultant phrase. So that's what we want. We want maximum competitive intensity because listen, the old Soviet Union, you know what? Very well educated people. They very high rates of literacy. They did a lot of scientific research. Spent a lot on the great scientists, and even the actual sort of Soviet organizations. They did reward effort. I mean, if you turned out more widgets, you would get a bonus. So there was incentive sort of work harder. And it was also a place that if there was a new way of doing things or new technology, it could just be ordered on high that you would have to use it. So there should have been a lot of innovation in the old Soviet Union, but there wasn't. There wasn't a lot of innovation. Why? Because the managers of those companies, even though they could maybe get a bonus, they were also worried that if I use this new technology, it was going to screw up my output for the next 6 months or the next year, and we wouldn't hit those marks. And they but they weren't going to fail. They weren't going to go out of business in the Soviet Union. There's no fear of failure. So you want big companies to have a fear of failure. They know they're not going to get bailed out. And they know if they don't innovate, there is going to be a very aggressive startup coming at them, maybe first taking the low-hanging fruit of their business and then working up. So that's really what I think startups are so key. They create that sort of competitive intensity that we need for more innovation.
So, Kristen, this is an interesting puzzle for center-right politicians and policymakers, because when you think about these big incumbent businesses that people in the startup world tend to think of as the enemy, they're the incumbents, the lazy ones, the ones we're trying to take on. But of course, they employ a lot of people. And they're comfortable doing business a certain kind of way for a reason, and also they make campaign donations. They're influential in their communities, for all kinds of reasons. So how do you reconcile that politically? I mean, because it sounds like when you say maximum competitive intensity to a kind of techno-libertarian, it sounds really exciting and fun.
Sexy, sexy phrase.
But when you're talking to kind of really risk-averse voters, when you're talking to the kind of companies that fear these kind of competitive threats from the outside, they might think about that differently.
Well, I think the important thing to keep in mind is that it's not just the people who want to start up these businesses who benefit from that maximum competitive intensity. It's people who are consumers of goods and services who see the quality of those goods and services increase and the cost of those goods and services go down that it also benefit. Take Uber, for example. So you can talk about how important it is that we foster an environment where the next Uber has an opportunity to take root and grow. But not everybody wants to start the next Uber, but an awful lot of people do like the fact that for a very low price, they can get a reliable, safe ride from point A to point B. So I think politically, one, talking about the ways that, encouraging more startups not only is good in terms of, if these startups take off, they create jobs, but it encourages those existing incumbents to want to be the ones to make themselves obsolete and to hopefully put pressure on them to innovate, for existing companies to innovate, but also that it's leading to the goods and services and changes in what our society is capable of that will improve quality of life across the board.
Pete, I have a theory. Tell me if my theory is stupid or not. I'm pretty sure it is, but I want to hear you tell me that definitively. So if you're looking at a business like Uber, it is creating lots of employment opportunities for people who are across the education spectrum. Some of them are, let's say, driving a vehicle while they're finishing their PhDs in physics. Some of them are people who never finished high school. Whereas if you look at your kind of, your classic startup in the kind of Zuckerbergian vein, we think of a company that's hiring eggheads. And what's interesting is that if I'm hiring eggheads, I'm never getting in any real regulatory trouble, at least not until I reach a really, really big scale. Whereas if I'm hiring kind of ordinary people who don't have, kind of super high levels of education or whatever else, then I'm getting in enormous amounts of trouble with regulators, with local governments, and everything else. Am I imagining this, or is this a real thing? And do you feel like that is shifting entrepreneurs in the direction of kind of more virtual or new economy businesses rather than kind of brick and mortar old school businesses?
I hate to tell you, I think you're kind of imagining it.
Okay, cool.
On the egghead side, look, you might get in trouble or deal with regulatory issues if you need to get engineers that need visas, H-1Bs, to get in the country, and you're dealing with the government in that type of a way. But no, I mean, look at at the boom that social media marketing caused over the past 10 years or so. You have tons of folks that aren't eggheads, but they're folks that you might have worked at a communications firm, a public affairs firm, a lobbying firm, what have you. You're dealing with a wide swath of Americans, white collar jobs, but you look at Airbnb and Uber when you can really employ in some way, shape, or form people from any kind of strata in life. You're just dealing with a different set of regulations.
So you don't think that the Ubers and Airbnbs of the world are dealing with more regulatory hassles? They all are dealing with them.
It's
they just
only
handle
by
them
the
differently.
industry that they're in. Look, when you try to displace the hotel industry, you're going to have some issues, right? Look at the amount of dollars that are spent by hotel companies and major chains on lobbying and making sure that certain regulations are dealing with their industry. Same thing with the stranglehold that for decades the taxi industry had. I mean, Washington, D.C. had more taxis per capita than any other city in America, and I think everyone in this room would probably argue that it was the absolute pits. I mean, period. I used to live on Capitol Hill when I was starting my first company, and I would scrape together every dime that I have to ride the train into New York to maybe go try to meet with a potential client. I'd come back at 11 o'clock at night, and I didn't want to spend the money for a cab, and when I did, they'd shove 5 other people in the cab from Union Station just to go 4 blocks. It was absurd.
Well, but Jim, it does seem as though, so we do have some startup activity, particularly in some sectors, but, I've seen some suggest that it's not generating the kind of robust employment growth that we might want to see. And that, kind of for many years, even kind of post-recession, you're looking at that balance of job creation and job destruction, and it's not as in favor of job creation as we'd want to see.
Yeah. Well, if I could just before I jump on that, just about the regular. Originally, I was going to have prepared remarks, and I didn't. And I had plucked out from the book this remark by Sam Altman from Y Combinator, where he said about regulation. Many of the companies I know that are innovating in the physical world struggle with regulatory challenges, and they're starting to leave. The biggest problem usually is they just can't get clarity out of the massive and slow government bureaucracy. I think that is an issue.
That's kind of the point I was trying to make to Peter.
Right. I think whether it's the physical world, I think a lot of regulation is bad. I think an ever-changing regulatory environment, I think that's bad. It just creates another barrier to entry. And as far as we're talking about these startups, but they're not kind of creating sort of the jobs per dollar of market capitalization as General Motors did. Well, one, that's absolutely true. You're not going to have many workers with Facebook. One, we forget about sort of all the spillover effect of these companies. That if they're in an area, you have a lot of these smart, very highly paid people. They do use services, and they create spillover economic growth. And my suggestion is, if we don't think these startups are creating enough jobs, well, part of what I'm doing here is saying I would like to create more. I would like to create more of these companies. That's what we need to do. We can't be dependent on creating a few mega companies that are going to hire a lot of people, and they're going to be sort of around, for 50 years, 100 years. It's going to be a dynamic environment, and if they're not creating enough jobs per dollar market capitalization, well, I'd like to create a few more.
Kristen, you started a business yourself relatively recently, and yet you're someone who's followed the startup world for a long time. You've certainly been very knowledgeable about the world of policy for a very long time. Was there anything that surprised you in the course of getting started yourself? Anything that came out of nowhere?
So to the point that Jim just made, I was surprised yesterday to discover, I think that the laws around how small businesses provide health insurance, I think it's changing as of the start of the next year, and so now I have to go back and assess and figure out, well, I've got this many employees, does that mean the law applies to me? And this was just a conversation I was having yesterday. I think for me, the thing that has surprised me is not the amount of money that my company has had to spend on complying with these things, although certainly accountants and lawyers all benefit greatly from the complicated regulatory structures that we have and the fact that it changes from state to state and that there's all these different levels of things you have to comply with. But I also think it's sort of the mental and the time resource that it takes from an entrepreneur, that this is time and energy and sort of brain power I'd love to be focusing on figuring out how to develop the next generation of survey research, and instead I'm figuring out how do I make sure that I don't get in trouble with with the Commonwealth of Virginia and the U.S. federal government when it comes to making sure my employees have adequate health care. And so these are the sorts of things that I think, in addition to the financial toll on businesses, just the time and the resources and the energy that has to be spent figuring out how to navigate all of this is something that I wasn't necessarily expecting.
Pete, you're an entrepreneur and investor, yet you're also someone who's been involved in politics. You've run for office yourself. And I wonder, when you're thinking about your own state, the Commonwealth of Virginia, what are some things that you thought in the course of your campaign you could do to make life easier for entrepreneurs like the ones that you're investing in?
Absolutely. I ran on a platform to eliminate the corporate income tax in Virginia. Given the area that we live in with the district and Maryland right next door, and what at the time Martin O'Malley was doing over in Maryland, it would have been a huge boon to the Commonwealth of Virginia to get rid of the corporate income tax. But then you look at a number of different other areas as well that you can apply really what government does best or worst, which is regulation and taxation. I mean, Mark Andreessen did a piece not too long ago that really tried to challenge the old model of how government approaches trying to find or create the next Silicon Valley. The model usually goes, you buy or have an office park, you make it look really nice, you have whatever local university do a little bit of R&D, and you might give a tax break there. And it's absurd. It rarely ever works. America is littered with these kind of office tech park campuses that are completely vacant. And what Andreessen argues for, which I agree with, is looking at the regulatory environment. So take in Detroit, you have the automotive industry. Certainly we all know, and the people at this terrific company know, that self-driving automobiles are coming very, very soon. So why don't you take a locality and re-engineer some of the regulations there to allow self-driving cars so that you have the 5 or 6 different players that are going to be a part of that industry's future going into the suburbs of Detroit, or I'd rather in the suburbs of Lynchburg, Virginia, wherever it may be. So really focusing on what government can do worst or best, which is taxation and regulation.
I have a follow-up question for you briefly on that. So, given that you were involved in the politics of Virginia, one pattern that's been observed by a lot of folks is that in Northern Virginia, precisely the area where you have the big concentration of technology workers, a tremendous amount of entrepreneurship, et cetera, this is a region that is, definitely pretty heavily skewed to the political left. And if you're looking at a lot of people who are working in the new economy, who are working for young entrepreneurial firms, they tend to gravitate to the left too. Is that something that you thought about as a candidate and something that you kind of have tried to overcome, or?
Sure. Look, if you look at Northern Virginia, I would argue that the liberalism of Northern Virginia has less to do with the tech sector or younger voters and more to do with an ever-expanding federal government. But if you look in Silicon Valley and in California, certainly there's a whole lot more liberals there. You have a whole lot of libertarians. But it's about what they encounter, okay? And let's go back a year when Terry McAuliffe just came into office in Virginia, and the Virginia DOT tried to outlaw Uber and didn't really realize that that was a lifestyle issue for voters between 18 to 25 or 18 to 35. So he stepped in it right away. You have a whole bunch of different, you had tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of potential voters out there that were irate that probably would have voted Democrat but saw Republicans trying to champion this. So it's all in what they experience. So I really, truly believe that for conservatives, for Republicans, they're especially in 2016, when you see the rhetoric that's coming out of the Hillary Clinton campaign, this is a terrific opportunity to show that conservatives know how to govern well and are going to speak to that audience.
Kristen, I imagine you have some thoughts on this too.
So there's a story that I remember from the 2012 campaign where President Obama was giving an interview on MTV, and he was being interviewed in the Oval Office by Sway Calloway, one of the VJs from MTV, and some of the questions were silly, and it was things about how he felt about hip hop and pop culture. But then he was asked a question, Mr. President, what have you done since you've been in office that has made it easier for young people to start a business? This is a generation that looks up to folks like Mark Zuckerberg. What have you done as president to help people achieve that dream? And I'm sitting back on my couch thinking, he's not going to have a good answer for this. I think he's made it harder. And his answer was flawless. His answer was, we took a look at the regulations that were on the books, and we saw that there were regulations prohibiting people from investing via the internet with small amounts of money, so crowdfunding, Kickstarter. This was prohibited by securities regulations. So we repealed that so that you can now have crowdfunding. This was a masterful answer. It's a conservative answer. It's a conservative answer about repealing onerous regulation. And it's actually based on a bill that came out of the House with Republican support, the Jobs Act. But you had the president on MTV taking credit for the idea. And to his credit, he had signed the bill. But I think a lot of the time, we on the center right have ideas that would really help entrepreneurs. And sometimes we don't really express them. I never heard a Republican out on the trail talking about this element of things to young people. And so we were sort of seeding the argument by not going there at all.
Jim, do you see, so I mean, you mentioned earlier on that the Obama administration is releasing a report on occupational licensing. So, one interpretation is that, well, thank goodness, we all see eye to eye on the central issues and, we can leave it at that. But I mean, do you believe that there is a distinctive way that conservatives and libertarians approach these issues surrounding startups and entrepreneurship? Kind of that is something that, ought to inform the way the right, frames itself, presents itself going forward? That's different from how liberals might see it?
Well, I would love that if every time there was going to be a debate about a tax bill, a regulation, a spending program, that the issue of how does this help innovation? How does this, help sort of the general policy ecology for startups? That sort of disposition is that I would love to become like a very ingrained habit, throughout government. Is that an ingrained habit on the left? I think there are uber Democrats. But I think they've been keeping a very low profile out there, because I don't see it. Does any Democrat call himself an uber Democrat? No. And I think there is a split among Democrats, among people who are more technology oriented. I'm not sure there's an age difference. And you sort of have, I think, a wing which see these technologies and sees them as disruptive in a bad way, disrupt them to existing forms, disrupting existing interest groups, and views them as a negative. So their first impulse is to say, oh, look at all these. Suddenly we have a nation of part-time workers and independent and the gig economy. Forget about the sharing economy. That sounds too friendly. It's the gig. Who wants a gig? A gig's not a career. So immediately, relabeling it as the gig economy, it's something negative that needs a government solution. We're viewing it as this slowly emerging, new evolving sort of sector of the economy with a business model. Hands off right away. Let's see what happens before we immediately come up with a 10-point plan to reclassify workers or otherwise regulate it. So I think still that is the impulse on one side, and I hope that's not the impulse on the other side.
And I think part of that too is that on the right we tend to think about, if there's a problem in society, we don't always default to government being the best way to solve it. And so if you take a look at something like the problem of getting from point A to point B in a safe and effective manner in a city like Washington, D.C., if you're more left-leaning, you're more likely to say, well, that just means we need to fund the metro better. And we need to have a government solution to provide more transportation for people. And I think on the right, our disposition is more open to the idea that maybe the best way we get people from point A to point B in a cost-effective and safe manner is not providing more money to the broken metro service, but instead creating an environment where something like Uber can emerge and the private sector can solve the problem. And I think on the right, we're more comfortable saying, let's let the private sector solve a problem, and the left is more averse to that. And the political dynamic there, unfortunately, is that in the aftermath of the recession, well, let's just let the private sector handle it, I think is a less appealing message than it may have been 10 years ago.
Here's one area where I imagine Pete and Jim might disagree. So Hillary Clinton, if nothing else, has certainly been throwing out a lot of policy ideas in her presidential campaign so far, one of which is this idea that we ought to encourage more long-term investment. And we ought to do that by tweaking the tax code so that we charge a lower rate of tax on capital income, that's been invested for a longer period of time. And Jim, you've actually said that you think that there's maybe some value to that approach, having a kind of rewarding long-term investment over short-term investment.
Well, that is sort of a way already the existing system where short-term investments are taxed at a higher rate. And the idea, which I've been talking about, I didn't originate, is, listen, I would love just to get rid of the capital gains tax. It's unlikely that's going to happen. There's not a lot of political support for it. There's also, there's a budgetary issue. So why not just sort of phase it down to reward the longer you hold an investment, the less capital gains tax you would pay. And who knows, maybe after 5 years, 8 years, something like that, it would be a very low rate or no rate at all. Now, the Hillary Clinton plan is a little bit different, in which she takes the existing rate, makes that the floor, and then sort of raises the ceiling, which is really not what I sort of was getting at. But I think being able to think creatively, and again, I'm not even sure all these changes tend to be sort of at the margin. I think something like that at the margin as part of a broader portfolio of ideas could help. I think it's something we should look at. But Pete, you think that's a lot?
Well, I actually agree with Jim on this one. Look, I'd love to get rid of the capital gains tax, starting at where we are now and going gradually lower for longer term investment. Terrific. From the book, I also loved the idea from Courtney Godaldig about getting rid of first term, any kind of equipment that was being purchased in the first year for entrepreneurs, being able to completely write that off or take that as expense is terrific.
How much of a difference do you think that would make? For the companies that you're investing in, to say that you can expense everything in the first year, or let's say you have a 5% rate of corporate income tax in your first 5 years. Do you think that would make a big, meaningful difference?
No, let's talk to a company that I invested in. Kristen, what do you think?
So, I think that also depends on to what extent.
Always invest in someone smarter than you are, period.
It depends on to what extent. The business is very, focused on buying a lot of stuff. For a business like mine, there's some purchases we needed to make, but we're not doing something where we needed to buy a bunch of machines to produce a lot of widgets. So, policy will affect different people in different industries for sure. But then there's also the fact that, there's corporate income tax, but a lot of small businesses are taxed through, it's taxed flow through income to the shareholders. So, there's all sorts of complexity there that my big thing is reducing the complexity and reducing the uncertainty, I think is the thing that, as somebody who is an entrepreneur and a small business owner, would be the thing that I think would help me most be able to maximize my competitive intensity.
When you were watching the president on TV and they asked, what have you done? Did he mention Obamacare?
He did not.
All right, because I'm kind of surprised, because I'm surprised that he didn't say, and we've created a healthcare system where people will feel more at ease leaving their current job and just and break, because especially maybe they're already married and they have a kid, and they're not going to want to leave the safety of that existing job and healthcare plan. And I think just putting that aside, I think the general idea of taking into account more generally worker anxiety, and looking at making sure we have a safety net that helps entrepreneurs, that makes sure benefits are portable, that people do feel maybe slightly more comfortable taking a risk. And I think if we're going to have this sort of lovely Schumpeterian, dynamic, creative destruction kind of society, we have to make sure we have a modernized safety net that encourages work, that's fiscally sustainable, that deals with problems as they are today, not as they were in 1930 or 1980. So I think that's sort of the other half, which I didn't get into, which other people do, I think, address in the book. Just like in this chapter, I don't really get into education. We have a lot on education, immigration. There's a lot on immigration. And I will say the cover of that book, which is not currently up there, for the family, which showed a bunch of little shoes all neatly in a row. That's a bad cover, because I have a big family and the shoes are never neatly in a row. There should have, first of all, they should have been all kind of beat up looking, and one shoe like this and the two left feet. But I think looking at generally the idea of entrepreneurship and sort of both sides, both sort of the very, again, the Schumpeterian dynamic side, but also making sure we have an appropriate safety net for that kind of society.
So a safety net for individuals, but not a safety net for companies.
Right. Yes, that's what I love. That's a perfect line. The companies don't deserve a safety net. They don't deserve bailouts. They don't deserve policymakers and politicians changing the tax code or regulation. No, they have to be on their own, be able to make it on their own, constantly under threat, constantly. I believe was it Andy Grove who says that every CEO has to be paranoid. They should be constantly worried that someone else can come up with a better technology that will put them out of business. I think that's the kind of intense competitive we want.
Yeah, one thing I do want to take issue with. Look, I'm all for portability and certainly focusing policy on innovation, but there seems to be this undercurrent of a drive towards comfort. Oh, if we only create the safety net, that everyone will feel comfortable and be more likely to start businesses. That's not the case. I got to tell you, rarely do entrepreneurial ideas come from happiness and comfort. It's true. Every once in a while you have a eureka moment and you're in the shower, oh my gosh, this would be terrific and it'd be wonderful. Usually an entrepreneur starts like this. You're in a current job and you're trudging in there and you say, oh my gosh, this is mind-numbing, or I can't believe we do things this way. There's got to be a better way. So I think discomfort is actually a very good thing for entrepreneurship. And if you look at the founding of our nation, it was started by the Virginia Company, and it wasn't just a bunch. There were some aristocrats that came over, but largely, if you were an aristocrat, you were fourth down on the food chain from your older brother who was an absolute tyrant, and you wanted to get the hell out of Dodge, and you went 3,000 miles across the lake to go do it. So discomfort is a good thing for entrepreneurship.
Well, there's another a view that one often encounters on the left, which is that when you're looking at a lot of the phenomena you're pointing to, sluggish growth, you're not seeing enough employment creation on the part of these new, including new innovative startups. But one view is that that's simply a matter of demand. Right. We just don't have enough aggregate demand. And as long as that's the case, you're just not going to have employment creation because, who are your customers going to be? What do you think about that view, Jim?
Right. That's sort of the handy catchphrase that's applied. It's sort of what they call middle-out economics. The problem in the economy, right, there's just not enough consumers buying things. And I think over the short term, the idea that there's not enough demand in an economy, that's fine. I think that is a completely valid theory that you can find in any textbook. But what you cannot find in any economic textbook, because I don't think it's actually a valid theory, that over the long term, what's really important in an economy is sort of consumer demand. What's really, and I'll quote the great Paul Krugman, who once said, productivity isn't everything, but it's almost everything. The ability, that's what having a more productive society, more output per worker. That is what is key to rising living standards. And what's going to generate more productivity is having more innovation. And again, how are we going to have more innovation? A big part of that is having a more vibrant startup culture. And that's how I guess that's how I would answer it.
By 2020, a majority of under 18s are going to be not non-Hispanic whites. Kristen, earlier on you mentioned some of the aspiration among millennial African Americans, Latinos to become entrepreneurs themselves. Tell us a little bit more about how these dynamics play out across different groups. Do you believe that a kind of more entrepreneurial center-right message could prove more appealing to non-white youths, or?
I think so. I think what's really powerful about focusing on entrepreneurship and on sort of disruption and disrupting the status quo is that it enables folks on the right to begin to shed what I think is this really unfair brand of being the movement of what's old, the grand old party, the movement of the past. That so often the status quo is actually being defended by the left. To take another example, you mentioned productivity. You had, I think, a couple of months or perhaps a year or two ago that President Obama gave a speech where he was sort of bemoaning the rise of the ATM as eliminating the jobs of the bank tellers, and some folks sort of jumped on this very quickly, like, no, it's actually not ATMs and the rise of technology that has allowed society to become more productive, which is hurting us badly. We should be celebrating this, but that all too often it actually is the left that kind of defends the status quo and is apprehensive about change and is apprehensive about things that would lead to less security, kind of more risk taking. So I think from a political perspective, in terms of appeal, focusing on issues like this allows the right to shed this unfair brand of being the movement of the past and of what's old.
Pete, what are you not hearing from the conservative presidential candidates in the race right now that you want to be hearing from them on entrepreneurship and innovation?
Well, look, I haven't picked a horse by any means yet. I did actually like Jeb Bush's comments about how, look, we need to be working more. Now, that wasn't oh, damn it, you need to work more hours in the day. It's that having a policy like Obamacare that forces so many companies to have folks under the 40-hour-a-week mark, it's a bad thing. It's to Jim's point about productivity. So I thought that was a good comment. I haven't seen a comprehensive vision really on how to grow America. Jeb Bush did a little of that. I think Scott Walker's nipping around the edges, but I haven't seen it. This has been, by and large, a campaign. It's early, light on policy.
Any questions from the audience?
Are we doing microphones, or are we just hollering at the top of our lungs? There's a microphone. Thank you. My name is Vince Cerf. I'm one of the vice presidents at Google. First of all, let's hear it for no-fault insurance for self-driving cars. Just a thought. Your definition of the left and mine don't match up terribly well. My world is filled with risk-taking and with the desire to try things new and to accept the possibility they might not work. So I'm a little puzzled by wondering which window we are each looking through. It seems to me, though, that right down at the bottom of everything, it is meaningful work is significant and important to every single citizen in the country. And finding a way to achieve that goal, which, by the way, does not necessarily mean paid for work. There's an economy whose size I don't know associated with volunteer work. And I've been curious about how much of our economy might be made up of people who choose to work because it's satisfying, even if they're not being compensated in cash. So one question I guess I have for you is whether the volunteer economy factors into any of the thinking that you have been doing so far about improving the American scene.
I mean, I think that this is a very deep question a lot of people have been raising.
Yeah.
Is GDP missing a lot of the value that's being created by new information services and what have you? You've given this some thought, Jim.
Right. I mean, that's a concern that that these productivity numbers and our GDP numbers, they're missing the value of the digital goods. They're missing
collaboration.
Exactly. All from collaboration. And plus there's sort of the broader issue that, well, let's say that all this works and we have we have more startups and more productivity and more technological advancement. And what if we have more people who sort of just aren't really adept at that kind of economy? Are we going to have a lot of people who sort of aren't working? Or maybe there's working fewer hours and there's going to be a lack of work in society. And I agree. I think finding meaningful things for people to do. I mean, AI, we have this thing, we have like a human flourishing program. What does it mean to flourish? It doesn't mean collecting a paycheck. It means finding a meaningful thing to do, whether it's a 40-hour job, maybe, or it's a 25-hour job and 15 hours of volunteer work. So I think there absolutely can be meaning, and I think that may be actually a big issue going forward. How do we find sort of meaningful hours for people in a society that hopefully, if all this works, will be far more technologically advanced in the future than it is today.
Mr. Sir, first and foremost, thank you for this thing called the internet. We're all grateful.
I didn't want to embarrass you.
As it relates to your question, look, I think if you look at policy, again, what can government do? What do they do well or poorly? On taxation, if you look over the past 16 years or so, in the Bush administration, you certainly had a lightening up on the regulatory environment for nonprofits. And in the first 6 years of the Obama administration, there has been a tightening up on the taxation or regulatory environment for nonprofits. I think that goes to a large part of where those volunteer hours going. They're going to nonprofits. So if we make it easier for nonprofits to operate, it should be better for the economy overall.
And there's actually a big element of that speaks to, I think, the millennial generation. This is a very sort of mission-driven generation where they want to change the world. And for some of them, maybe that means going into government, but for a lot of them, it means either starting up, social entrepreneurship, starting up a company that will address some kind of key social need, or going and working in the nonprofit sector. And so I think what you raise is something that's particularly important to my generation, because so many of us don't just want to earn that paycheck. We'd rather, survey after survey actually shows that folks in my generation would rather take a little bit less money if they feel like what they're doing is contributing meaningfully to the world. So I think you've touched on something very important. And to your point, by the way, about the left perhaps being what's old, again, these are painting with very broad brushstrokes. And primarily, I think, when I think about the right versus left and old versus new, a lot of that I think revolves around sort of government bureaucracy and programs and regulations, and in many cases it being the right that has a greater appetite to maybe take some of this on. But certainly I think, as I mentioned earlier, President Obama signed a law that made it easier for young people to crowdfund, do Kickstarter and things. So it's not just a one-party issue, for sure.
I will add that when we have tech CEOs come to AEI, we have come an ongoing program, and many of whom are Democrats. They sound a lot different than the Democratic politicians who come on over to give speech. In fact, many of them I'm listening to, I can't believe these guys aren't Republicans. I can't believe that I keep trying to find the traditional Democrat stuff, and I can't find it. So maybe it's our bias from being here.
One thing that's also worth keeping in mind is that one of the reasons we care about GDP is that we care about the activities that we can actually tax to use to finance overburdened safety net institutions and what have you. So it could be we're enabling all kinds of interesting forms of collaboration that are happening outside of monetized output, which is great, but doesn't actually solve the problem of how do we finance our highways or whatever else. We have time for one more question from a gentleman on that side.
Yeah, sorry, Jeff Spross from The Week. Hi, Jim, Rayhan. So you mentioned that we had a burst in the late 90s of the kind of innovation and productivity we'd like to see. And so I was wondering, do you have any thoughts on what was different temporarily or whatever in that time period, be it in terms of policy, regulation, or something else that could give us a clue as to what happened? Just like in terms of like broad structural realities, anything that we could connect to that.
And we have only time for one.
I would like to think that you can make short-term policy changes and have a burst, but I think it's probably a combination of short-term things that were done, but also probably longer-term policy changes that were also put in place in the 80s, plus probably the natural sort of life cycle of technologies and sort of a happy coincidence of the three of those things.
All right, thank you very much, everyone. Excuse me.
Thanks very much. Not only entertaining, but thought-provoking.
So Senator Cornyn is on his way up, and in just a few minutes, Susan Molinari from Google will welcome him with a proper introduction. In the meantime, let me just make sure you know about all the products that we have that are here that hopefully you'll get a copy of before we leave. In addition to the startups chapter that we just heard about, we have copies of the other two volumes that we released today on higher education and the environment and energy that are over on this table. We also have a one-pager that provides a short description of each of the other 16 volumes that will be released over the course of the summer and fall, along with the authors of those. And of course, it would not be a CRN event without some swag. So we have your own custom CRN coffee mug. Please take them. They are too heavy for us to take back to the office. So with that, in just a minute, we'll welcome Susan Molinari and Senator Cornyn. Thank you.
Don't go anywhere. Senator Cornyn is on the elevator. So, good morning. I didn't know you were here. Shouldn't be surprised. Good morning, everybody. Well, good afternoon it is now. I'm Susan Molinari. I'm Vice President of Government Affairs and Public Policy here at Google. And I want to welcome you all here. We're really thrilled to have you. More importantly, my job right now was to stall until the man walked in the building. So I am now given the great honor of introducing a man to whom needs no introduction, not only in Washington, D.C., but throughout this country. Really happy to, first of all, Google welcomes you. We're really excited to have you all here. And obviously, this is a topic that is near and dear to our hearts and we believe is so important and invaluable to the future, not only of this country, but of the world. And so for all of you to be so interested in disruption is just makes my heart feel so good. And when you talk about the power and potential of technology to be a force for good and a force for change, there's really nobody who has spent his career making sure that that happens and making sure that government adopts the right policies to allow all these things to flourish than Senator John Cornyn. He does need not any introduction, but he is the man who really has a keen insight to how technology works, what it needs to work from government, and how best to use it. We've been given the great honor here at Google to work closely with Senator Cornyn because I think most of you know he has been an unbelievable, outspoken champion bulldog against sex trafficking of minors, particularly here in the United States. He was here at an event we had, and we were given an opportunity to go back to his home state of Texas and carry on that conversation. And he led a really important piece of legislation and has basically almost single-handedly in Washington, D.C. and Capitol Hill changed the conversation on behalf of our young girls who are being misused and abused. So it is my great honor to introduce to you Senator John Cornyn.
Well, Susan, let me start by saying thanks to you and Google, the Google team, for all of your good work and support of our efforts to combat human trafficking. It only took us a month to get this bipartisan bill across the Senate floor, which gives you an indication of how even broadly supported bipartisan legislation, nothing is easy in the United States Senate. But I'm honored to be here with all of you today, and thanks for sending me an invitation to speak to the Conservative Reform Network. The way I viewed this invitation, it's really an invitation to brag about Texas. So I readily accepted it, and I'm really glad to be here to do that. And those of you who know Texans, you know Texans are proud, they're loud, and they love their state. But to me, this is all about being a conservative too, because conservatives believe actually in the importance of the states, not just the federal government, and believe that the states can truly be those laboratories of democracy where different policy prescriptions can be tried, and then if they work, then those best practices adopted at the national level. And that's been true in so many areas. Currently, we're working on things like prison reform and the like, but certainly in the economic field, it is absolutely the case that I think we have a pretty good idea about what works and what doesn't work. So according to the Small Business Administration, small businesses represent about 99% of all employers in Texas and employ close to 50% of the state's private sector labor force. We boast 2.4 million small businesses in a state of 27 million people. And these startups have been attracted to Texas and been able to thrive in this state because our economy's been a good landing place, a place where people can try new ideas, where they're able to attract the capital and the investment, and where they have the freedom to then prosper if they've got a good idea that actually works, and don't have to worry about government trying to constantly undermine or burden their ability to succeed. And so I would just simply conclude up front that Texas is absolutely the best place in the country to do business. It absolutely is. And that's why we're seeing people vote with their feet coming from other parts of the country to Texas, because that's where they have opportunity. I have to give the former governor, Rick Perry, a lot of credit. I know he spent a lot of time working on recruiting businesses from around the country, particularly California. I began to worry a little bit about the demographics of all that because we're a red state, and having people coming from blue states to red states made me a little nervous that we would turn purple, perhaps. But that hasn't happened, because just like the immigrant population that has made America what it is today, it was composed of the risk takers and the people that were looking to pursue their dreams and provide for their families. According to Forbes, our economy, our $1.5 trillion economy, ranked first in current economic climate and for growth prospects. For the 11th year in a row, CEOs have named Texas the best place to do business, and 5 Texas cities, more than any other state, are listed in the top 10 of America's fastest growing cities. This growth has contributed not only to a lot of contribution of job creators, it's created a lot of jobs. And I might just note at this point, you know, sometimes here in Washington you hear this argument that people are all for jobs, but yet when they turn around, they seem to be at war with the job creator. And as my former colleague Gordon Smith used to say, you can't claim to love the worker and hate the employer. And maybe it isn't an actual mental state of animosity toward the employer, but by practices, taxation, regulation, and the like, it turns out that way. So when it comes to jobs, since the fiscal meltdown of 2008, Texas has actually added jobs 56 out of 57 months, including a total of more than 53,000 in the first half of 2015. And just as importantly as jobs are wages and wage growth. As you know, wages have been stagnant across this country for a long, long time now. But we've actually seen significant wage growth along with this job creation in Texas. Again, I think it's because of some of the policies. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 19 out of Texas's 26 large counties have recorded wage growth that was well above the national average. And 2 of these counties placed in the top 10 for wage growth nationwide. So these businesses and companies are also making staying in Texas, not just coming there, but staying there worthwhile in the form of good paying jobs and rewarding careers. But in addition to our stellar economy, what else contributes to the success of startups and innovation in Texas? Well, I have to tell you that even though I live in Austin, and Austin is viewed as the focal point for innovation and startups, it's not just limited to Austin. It really covers the entire state. But ultimately, it's founded on a perfect mix of good old-fashioned common sense and sound policies that include lower taxes, reasonable regulation. We don't have an income tax, which I tell all of my friends from high-tax states, we don't have an income tax. Come to Texas, you'll get a pay raise. Cost of living is lower than it is in the Northeast. I just think it's pretty obvious why people are moving there, because they find an opportunity to thrive and to grow and to pursue their dreams. And so this has helped provide a stable economic environment in which businesses can operate. And this environment makes us an attractive place for big corporations, obviously, to come down, all the way down to first-time business owners. These policies, of course, reduce the risk to these startups and these entrepreneurs compared to other states with more onerous regulation and higher obstacles to job creation. But instead of relying on government alone, the attitude of many Texans is to look to foster collaboration between public and private sector, not to look to government, particularly to look to Washington as a solution to our problems. Ultimately giving local businesses and local educators and local folks the chance to collaborate and come up with creative solutions. Just one interesting example, at least it is to me. As you know, Texas is an energy state, and one of the things that we've been able to do, thanks to the miracle of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, I know that's not necessarily popular everywhere, but it is in Texas, and it's produced a huge economic boom. But it's also created a lot of pressure on educators and a need for a trained workforce. So what do the folks in Laredo, Texas decide to do? That's right down there on the border. Mr. Trump just made a quick visit there for an hour or two, I guess it was. But at United High School in Laredo, Texas, I visited it was a program in petroleum geology for ninth graders. And the idea was these ninth graders would grow up and graduate from high school and be looking for jobs in their community. And thank goodness, thanks to the Eagleford Shale, which is a huge reservoir of oil and natural gas right there along the border region, these students could, if they applied themselves, learn the skills they needed in order to qualify for good well-paying jobs once they graduated from school. And the great thing about the local community was these students could actually attend junior college while they were still in high school and concurrently basically graduate from high school and also earn college credit. Not only did they acquire skills which enabled and qualified them for the good high-paying jobs that are available and that will be available in the future, they also have dealt with a big problem when it comes to the cost of education. Because as we all know, too many young people go to four-year colleges and universities, perhaps even get graduate degrees, burdened by massive college debt and unable to find jobs in a field for which they are qualified. So this innovative, collaborative effort in Laredo, Texas, was addressed specifically to try to provide the training that was needed in order for these students to acquire the skills to qualify for good, high-paying jobs. And so we're not talking about government mandating a minimum wage. We're talking about how can we equip these young men and women to earn a maximum wage that their talent and their diligence and their skill qualifies them for. But the reason why schools like United High School in Laredo, Texas are able to do that is because they had the freedom and flexibility to develop their own curriculum. And they were able to prosper because they were able to work with the local community, not just worried about checking the box and meeting the mandate requirements emanating from Washington, D.C. And this really has happened across the state. And I know when people look at Texas, perhaps they think, well, everybody in Texas looks like me, which is not true. We have a large minority population. 38% of our population is Hispanic. Actually, the third most commonly spoken language in Texas today is Vietnamese, believe it or not. About almost 250,000 Vietnamese Americans who've moved to Texas. And we have a very diverse population, and even more so because we've attracted new people and, of course, the people who've moved there over time. Well over 1/3 of the businesses in Texas are minority-owned, and more than 20% of business owners are foreign-born. 1/3 minority-owned, 20% foreign-born. And we also are proud to have the second fastest rate of growth for job-owned, women-owned businesses this year, with 116% growth, the second fastest growing state for women-owned firms this year. So when I go back to Texas and get a chance to travel, whether it's from the Panhandle in North Texas down to the Gulf Coast region or the Rio Grande Valley or way out in West Texas at El Paso, we've got all sorts of exciting collaborations like I described in Laredo, Texas. For example, the Texas A&M Coastal Bend Business Innovation Center in Corpus Christi, that's right down along the Gulf Coast, which serves as an incubator for startups, and since its founding in 2009, has generated millions of dollars in salaries while helping more than 100 companies get on their feet. And then in Fort Worth, Cowtown as we like to call it, I attended a roundtable of local startups with several groups, including Texas Christian University's Neely Entrepreneur Center, the Tech Fort Worth Group, a nonprofit business incubator, and the Fort Worth Business Assistance Center. In Lubbock, Texas, for the Red Raiders in the crowd, I attended a similar discussion at Texas Tech's Rawls College of Business and at their Small Business Development Center. So this sort of culture of startups and innovation and entrepreneurship doesn't just exist in one small region of my state. It really pervades the entire state. And when you think about the pioneers that came to Texas, it really represents sort of the DNA which has helped make us in many ways unique and in some ways make us a little obnoxious to the rest of the state and the rest of the country and the rest of the world, because we are intensely proud of who we are and what's been accomplished thanks to the freedom and the innovation and the great ideas and the hard work of so many people who've come there to make it home. So I mentioned these meetings I've had throughout the state for two reasons. First, they indicate the incredible interest in this topic across the state. And second, it underscores to me how involved and invested diverse local communities are and promoting innovation in small businesses. So to conclude, I hope, as my remarks have made clear, our job as conservatives is to figure out how can we facilitate through sound public policies the kind of environment where people will want to take a risk, where they'll want to invest, where they want to do the hard work, where they want to come up with a better idea, and where we all benefit from that. By the fact they create jobs, they help grow the economy, they help grow and improve wages, and if we as public policymakers are pursuing the right policies, not a one-size-fits-all mandate from Washington, D.C., but those that we've tried and we've demonstrated actually work, and then we take those policies perhaps to the national stage, I think we can do a better job. And we can also do a better job when it comes to appealing to voters, because you know the old rap on conservatives is that conservatives don't care. Conservatives may have good brains, but they don't have a very warm heart. And I think we can demonstrate that our policies actually are the ones that help with the wage growth, help with job creation. And the flexibility and freedom that we believe in our bones is the right recipe for people to pursue their dreams, no matter how modest their station in life or the circumstances of their birth. So if we continue to provide people with the education and the training and tools in order to qualify them for good, high-paying jobs, we don't have to get mired down in all of the demagoguery associated with minimum wage and the wedge politics that we hear so much here in Washington, D.C. So let me just conclude by saying thank you very much for indulging me. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for letting me brag on my state, just one of those great laboratories of democracy, which I think teach us a lot of important lessons. And I admit, even though I'm a Texan, that there are other states that can also teach us a lot about what we can do to stay true to our principles as conservatives, but also to show how our policies are the ones that actually benefit hardworking American families, no matter if they're, who they are, where they come from, or how they pronounce their last name. Thank you very much.
Yeah, the fellas seem to want me here. I was told to sit here. Sorry. Thank you, Senator Cornyn. It's the job of our next panel to just give you a very brief overview of the overall project, Room to Grow a series, and a quick preview of it. We'll have fuller discussions later on both higher education reforms and energy and the environment, but a quick preview of both of those terrific papers, because we have our talented author of higher ed here, Andrew Kelly. You'll be hearing more from him in the future. I'm Kate O'Byrne, and I'm delighted to be part as a advisor on this policy project, and I'll tell you why. I've spent my professional life engaged in conservative policy, and I've never been part of such an unprecedented effort. Because what has the Conservative Reform Network done? They identified incredibly bright policy people from different think tanks and universities and brought them together under the umbrella of the Conservative Reform Network in this collaborative, cooperative, creative effort. And this particular series, I think, is structured in such a way to be really helpful, which was our inspiration, our desire, to typical policymakers. So you'll see that each paper first lays out the problem for somebody who's wondering, you know, where did I read that about the cost of higher ed? What's happened over the past 25 years? It's there. Creative new solutions, polling data, I mean, a real primer on the policy issue. So we're joined now by Neil Bradley, who you've all already met, Yuval Levin, and Ramesh Ponnuru. We were so fortunate. We had incredibly bright policy people writing policy papers, and then two of the most gifted editors in the country doing the overall editing of this project. Yuval Levin is editor, of course, of National Affairs, that terrific quarterly magazine. He's a fellow at AEI and a fellow at Ethics and Public Policy Center. And Ramesh Ponnuru, of course, is a senior editor at National Review. He writes for Bloomberg View, and he also is a fellow at AEI. I'm going to call on both of them as soon as I've asked Neil, as soon as Neil gives us a brief overview of the overall Room to Grow a Series project. Conservatives could be forgiven for wondering. We've had a Republican president for 8 years. We've had Republican Congresses. The kind of changes we'd like to see simply haven't happened. Why does this agenda, why should it give conservatives reason to think that this will be different, that these reforms, right, are practical enough, can win the kind of support they need to make the real change that conservatives are looking for as they watch Washington continue, it seems, to grow ever larger and more intrusive? Neil.
Well, thanks, Kate, and thanks for your efforts on this project. I think the answer to that question kind of lies in what I see as the two kind of impetuses behind this initiative. The first was a recognition that the problems that our nation faces and that families and entrepreneurs and even established businesses and our communities face today aren't the same problems that we faced when Ronald Reagan was elected or when Republicans first took the majority in Congress in 1995. And because the problems aren't the same, the solutions can't be the same either. Conservatives, in my opinion, deal in reality, and we have to understand what all these institutions of our society are facing, the problems that they're most often dealing with, and what the solutions are to those problems. I love Ronald Reagan. I became a conservative because of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan would not run on the same agenda he ran on in 1980 because he was a conservative and he realized his solutions had to match the problems of that day. I think that's what we're doing as part of this series, is identifying those problems and then the solutions that go with it. The second impetus for it, and why I think this could be and will be ultimately more successful, is something that frustrated me for years on the Hill. We would have these polling briefings, and those of you who've worked in politics or campaigns get these all the time, where the pollsters come in and tell you about the Democrat issues and the Republican issues. The Democrat issues are the issues where Democrats are more trusted, and Republican issues are the ones where Republicans are more trusted. And we're told, stick to the Republican issues. To me, conservatives have solutions on all issues. And it's our job to talk about those solutions to all issues. If the American people don't trust conservatives on an issue, oftentimes it's because, as Senator Cornyn alluded to at the end, their perception is we don't care. That's a real problem. If you're a middle-class family worried, as Andrew writes about in his chapter, about paying for your kids' college, it's not good enough that Republicans say, gosh, well, yeah, tuition's really high, and part of the problem is federal student aid. Well, what's our solution? That's why we have this book today. If you're concerned about the environment, we have to have something to say there, and I think it's going to be meaningful, and I think that's why giving conservatives something to talk about on all these issues that demonstrate not only that we care, but that we deserve to be trusted is going to make the difference.
Yuval, the series includes detailed proposals programmatically on education and employment, Social Security, and healthcare. Are you engaged in just managing the welfare state? Have you given up on cutting Washington down to size?
Well, not at all. I think if you look at these proposals, if you look at these booklets and at the first Room to Grow, you'd find that what we're doing is actually more aggressive with regard to confronting the liberal welfare state than conservatives tend to be, not less aggressive. Because if you were to step back from what conservatives have had to say in most of the Obama years and just ask yourself what really is the problem, you'd have to conclude that many people on the right just think that the liberal welfare state costs too much. And so if we spend a little less on it, we'll be in much better shape. It certainly does cost too much, but the problem, the ultimate problem, and the reason it costs so much runs much deeper. And what we're trying to get at with a lot of these proposals and these ways of thinking about government is really to get to closer to the bottom of the differing worldviews that make the left and right what they are. And they're not just differences about federal spending. They're differences about how to solve problems, differences about the nature of American society and how people thrive in our society, and differences about what our problems are. I think if you look at these proposals, one of the things that unites them is certainly a sense that where Americans thrive and where American society draws its strength from is those institutions that exist between the individual and the state. A lot of times on the left, at least implicitly, people talk as though society consists of individuals and a national government. When there are problems, the government can help, and certainly sometimes it can. And that means that all common action is fundamentally political action, is national government action. When you actually look at American life, most common action is not that. It involves people working together in communities, in families even, in civil society, in the private economy, in local government and state government, and at the federal level. And you have to take society as a whole and think about how it can best address different kinds of problems. And conservatives speak to those mediating institutions because we believe that ultimately that's where people actually succeed and thrive. And that the most important role of government in domestic affairs is to sustain the space for those institutions to succeed and do their work. Secondly, I think we differ about how to solve problems in a way that's very related to this way of understanding how society operates. Conservatives think that it's unlikely that the kind of immense body of knowledge that would be necessary to address some of the large national problems we have, it's unlikely that it would really be found in the hands of a few technical experts gathered together in Washington, however benign and well-meaning their motives are, and they surely are. It's just not likely that they're going to be able to solve the problem in a centralized way. It's more likely that problems like that are going to be addressed in a bottom-up way by letting people on the ground try different ways of addressing the problems as they confront them, see what ways are working, let consumers choose, let beneficiaries choose, let citizens choose, and keep what's working and drop what's not working. The structure of many federal programs doesn't allow for any of that to happen, doesn't allow for experimentation with different solutions, doesn't allow for people to make choices about what's working for them, doesn't allow failures to go away. And a lot of the solutions that you'd find in these proposals involve moving from those kinds of centralized programs to the other model, a model that lets people make choices and lets those choices matter, right? A lot of the more familiar conservative policy ideas look like this. That's what school choice is, as opposed to our existing K-12 system. That's what conservatives want to do in healthcare. It's what we want to do in welfare. And you'll find in a lot of these proposals that it's what conservatives want to do across the board. Let people make choices that matter, not because we have some kind of fetish for choice, but because we think that that is ultimately more likely to arrive at solutions to genuinely serious and difficult problems than thinking that if we just get the right people in a room in Washington, they'll come at it. These are actually difficult problems. The answers are not obvious. And the question is, how do you address these kinds of challenging problems? We tend to think that experimenting, letting different kinds of solutions get worked out and tried is just more likely to succeed. And I think that's a much more aggressive way of trying to transform the way the federal government works than cutting some money off the top.
Ramesh, in November 2012, voters were asked, who cares about people like you? And the answer was Barack Obama, not Mitt Romney. How did that happen? And does this project, how might this project address that bind that candidates find themselves in?
That question has not just bedeviled Mitt Romney, but a lot of other Republicans. John McCain had the same problem in 2008. The poll was worded a little bit differently, but the same basic result. And I think it has to do with a certain kind of exhaustion of the conservative program to which Neil alluded. We had a very successful conservative program developed in the late 1970s to meet the challenges of that time. So you address stagflation by cutting the top tax rate and restraining monetary growth. For example, you meet Soviet adventurism with a defense buildup and an ideological campaign against communism worldwide. But the program has stayed in place for conservatives even after the circumstances it was designed to meet have changed. And partly they've changed because that program was successful. I think by the middle of the last decade, conservatism was no longer offering the kinds of solutions to people's current day problems that it once did. If you think again back to that Reagan era conservative program. There was an offer to the great American middle, which was vote for us, you will be safer because crime will be down, you will no longer have gas lines, you will have higher take-home pay. All of that happened, but what was the conservative offer that was being made in the last couple of elections? Not only wasn't there one, Governor Romney actually made a virtue of the fact that he didn't offer any such offer. I mean, that was his whole point when he talked about how it was virtuous not to offer gifts to the American electorate, not to tell people that our reform agenda would actually improve anybody's life. I don't think that that is a viable model. I think it's time the conservatives came up with a set of proposals rooted in conservative principles that apply to today's circumstances.
So one of the challenges is for conservatives to learn how to do a better job of talking about the concrete effects of their policies, like what in higher ed?
Right. Well, higher education, I think, is a great issue where we could be doing a lot by simply applying conservative principles of competition and deregulation and choice that would really improve people's lives, improve our economy. One of the examples I was just talking about was taxes. We talk about the top tax rate. That was a huge problem in America. We had a 70% top tax rate in the United States when Reagan took office. It was a huge problem for the American economy. We made huge improvements on that. And it's not as big of a problem as it is today. So we have to come up with different strategies, different solutions. Higher education, I think, is a similar case. Reagan and the Reagan-era conservatives were not great innovators when it came to higher education. We had an existing strategy in place that seemed to work. We had a much lower percentage of the population that had college degrees, and the basic strategy of funneling money into American colleges, getting more people to attend them, was paying off reasonably well, and we just kept doing it. I think that the data over the last couple of decades, which Andrew gets into in this booklet, suggests that we have reached diminishing returns with that strategy too. Prices keep rising, graduation rates are not great. People who do get graduated spend a lot of time in college, a lot more time than they used to. People end up with a lot of student loan debt and not necessarily making great use of their degrees. A lot of them are making it as going into colleges as an economic investment. It's not really panning out. So our strategy in response has to change. It can't be what Andrew characterized in that booklet as the strategy of the liberals, which is essentially spend more money, watch tuition rise, spend more money again. And instead, there's about 7 different strategies that Andrew suggests, including let's open up the accreditation process, let's make the colleges have to be on the hook for some of the student loan defaults that they generate, so that it's not just a matter of indifference to them whether their students graduate and are able to be successful. All of these are areas where I think there are some real conservative solutions that could help people. There may be, on some cases, places where liberals can collaborate with us and buy into some of these things, but I think there are areas where conservatives are going to have to lead the way, because the principles here are conservative principles, and the institutions that we're seeking to reform, the institutions that make up the higher education cartel, are more comfortable as members of the existing liberal coalition. We're not tied to them either for ideological or coalition reasons, and therefore as conservatives, we can and should take the lead in reform.
I've long thought higher ed reform is a natural for conservatives. So again, the paper's available today, and we look forward to a fuller discussion on higher ed reform. For the moment, again, a quick preview of energy and the environment, again, available today. Neil, some conservatives take some pleasure, who haven't been very active on the issue of the environment, when people are asked in an open-ended way what policy issues are important to them, and frequently the environment comes in dead last. If that's the case, why should conservatives be engaging in this issue area that polls tell us people might not care all that much about?
I think there are a couple reasons. I think first it's a values issue. The Pope, who has quite a megaphone and, frankly, fairly high approval rating, made that pretty clear.
Especially where it counts.
Especially where it counts. Made that clear this summer. And, frankly, a lot of the response from Republicans and conservatives wasn't that constructive. It was almost to dismiss his involvement in this issue. From a personal level, I have a 4-year-old son. He comes home from preschool and he tells his mother and I to turn off the lights when we leave the room and to shut off the water when we're brushing our teeth. That is not because he's convinced of the policy merits of conservation. It's because even in preschool, they learn about this as a value set. So ignoring it means we're ignoring people's values. Steve Hayward, who's the author of the Environment and Energy book, makes another important reason very succinctly, and that's this, to quote Stephen. Because the environment is too important to leave to environmentalists. And I think that's exactly right. Because the environmentalists and the EPA today view the solution to every problem as regulation. Conservatives are not reflexively always anti-regulation. But I think conservatives recognize that regulation is not the only solution to the problem, and frankly, 9 times out of 10 isn't the best solution to the problem, and we ought to be talking about the best solutions to the problem. I personally believe that's innovation. The whales of the oceans are alive today. They're not extinct because John D. Rockefeller figured out a way to get cheap kerosene to light people's homes. That was all innovation. Stephen speculates that the first trillionaire in the world might be the person who figures out a low-cost, reliable alternative to hydrocarbons. We should be all about that. The conservative agenda on the environment should be focused not on regulation and not on subsidies, but on the innovation that's going to take us to the next level, and really help us solve these problems. And when regulation needs to exist, and in some cases it has helped, regulation ought to be, just like it ought to be everywhere else, it ought to be transparent, it ought to be minimal, there ought to be accountability to it. One of my favorite suggestions in his chapter is to convert the EPA to a multi-member commission. That sounds very Washington-esque, but think about it for a minute. We let the SEC regulate the financial markets, and we entrust that to a 5-member commission. The FCC and the airwaves, and we trust that into a commission. The EPA, which is trying to regulate the entire economy, is one person, sole decision. Why do we like commissions? Because commissions bring debate, minority views, and accountability, because ultimately the commissioners have to vote. Now, I'm sure some people in Washington will say, well, hey, if we can just get the administration, we can fix this ourselves. That should not be our approach. Our approach should be whoever is in charge, we want a system that works a lot better and that's a lot more accountable. And I think that's a solution. And to take that right back to where I started, those are things that we can talk about as conservatives that are good for the environment, that focus on the opportunities and the prospects for innovation and smart environmental policy that demonstrate not only do we care about the issue, but ultimately we're worthy of people's trust on the issue. And that's ultimately what I think we can do and win back.
I think what brings a lot of these things together, Kate, is that in both of these issues and in many of the ones we've taken up here, for many years there's been a pattern where the left points to some counterproductive solutions to a problem, and the right's answer is to deny that the problem exists at all. And in many of these cases, the reason these problems are before our political system is because some significant portion of the public is concerned about them. And ultimately, to believe in limited government, to believe that government is there for limited purposes, is to believe that it's there to solve specific problems that confront the country. Not that it's there to manage the country in an ongoing way, but precisely that policy is problem solving. And that means that when some significant portion of the public thinks we're confronted with a problem, to say no we're not is not the right solution, especially if in fact we are, as surely is the case in these areas, as is the case with our healthcare system. What you find in a lot of these cases too is that the problem as it now presents itself is often caused or made much worse by the liberal approach to problem solving. So that in higher education, The problem is fundamentally a problem of cartelization, a problem of the way in which the liberal welfare state approaches our society's institutions. We find much the same in the environment. We find much the same in healthcare. The problem to be solved very often is the liberal welfare state, and the solution is not to say there's not a problem. That's just a way of stepping back and saying, fine, we don't care, just spend a little less.
And that's also true in higher education. You see op-eds sometimes from conservatives arguing, look, all these problems are exaggerated, and some of them are indeed exaggerated, but I do believe in the basic political principle that the foot knows best where the shoe pinches, and the fact is people are concerned about the cost of higher education, about the payoff of higher education, about the accessibility of it, and we need to address this and not tell people not to worry their pretty little heads about it.
We're going to be joined by Majority Leader McCarthy in just a minute or so, but we have a final question for you, Ramesh. As you've all explained, thus the title, Room to Grow, getting government out of the way and permitting bottom-up innovation, experimentation, some solutions will work, some will fail. You're asking the public, our fellow citizens, to accept, in the face of what they perceive to be real problems, that kind of experimentation, possible failure, we'll try again, when the progressive agenda is offering them something sort of sure. We'll fix this problem for you. You know you can count on us. Are our fellow citizens still inclined, the proverbial question, to pick freedom over security, perceived security?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's certainly in conservative rhetoric a tendency to romanticize and celebrate the taking of risk in a way that not all Americans find attractive. We tend to think of it as, you know, as the Republican Party is largely sociologically a party of small business people, but not everybody wants to start a business. And I think what we have to do is talk about, A, the concrete benefits that people will get from a conservative reform agenda, and B, the illusory nature of the guarantees that liberals are constantly making. I think, for example, in the area of retirement security, we need to be able to explain that the promises that have been made with respect to Medicare and Social Security are not sustainable. I think that people understand that. So we have, in order to have this fair competition of ideas, you've got to break down the idea that those guarantees that liberals are making are actually real, take it to the bank guarantees.
Good. Thank you, Ramesh. And thank you, Yuval and Neil. And we look forward to continuing the discussions on these topics as we release more books. Thank you for your attention. And I'm not going to stand in the way of our next speaker.
Thank you, panel. Thank you. It's so nice to have so many friends here. First of all, thank you, everybody. I am not going to stand in the way of our next speaker either, because this is all his brilliant vision. It is, when you talk about startups, entrepreneurship, Leader McCarthy not only talks the talk, but walks the walk, and has been doing it. He started his own small business when he was 21. Did I get that right? Where is he? He's here. 19, sorry. So here's somebody who really knows what it takes for entrepreneurship and has a vision, and we're just so grateful that he has taken that vision to the halls of the United States Congress. So Leader McCarthy, please come up to the podium. Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
Before we go, tell us what the business was.
Oh, okay. You want to know a quick story about it? But this is how I got in politics, just so you know. Okay. So, how many are from California? Anybody? Anybody know where Bakersfield is? All right, you all broke down, huh? You didn't study. That's understudy. Well, Bakersfield is north of LA. And if you ever read The Grapes of Wrath, it's the shanty town where everybody ended up. All right. It's diverse. It's agriculture. It's oil, and it's aerospace. Like 2 families grow 80% of all the carrots in the country. And you want to talk about innovation, and you think about innovation? Okay, everybody grew carrots, right? Just these 2 families grow 80% of all the carrots. You ever eat a baby carrot? Yeah, there's no such thing. They're big carrots, and they chop them, and they charge you more. And you know what? One farmer came to town and did that and took the other carrot farmer out. It was innovation. Things you don't think of, you know? How does Uber come? Because taxi's been around so long. Same idea. Well, anyways, so I'm growing up. Father is a fireman. He moves furniture on his days off. I'm the last of the family. I get out of high school, and I don't really apply myself, but I have a hell of a good time. And so I can't get into any colleges, so I'm going to my junior college. But I always had a summer job. So I had saved my money and I always believed I was an entrepreneur before an entrepreneur, right? So I meet a guy that owns a liquor store but has a car dealer's license. You figure out how an 18-year-old meets a guy like that. It was really the only liquor store that'd sell to you, okay? So I talk him into taking me to the LA car auctions, which are 2 hours away. But you have to be a dealer to get in. This is where all the dealers bring their trade in. So I would go there and I would buy and sell cars and flip them to pay my way through college. Now, I found out later it's illegal, but I'm being an entrepreneur, right? That's one entrepreneur. I don't have a business line, but this is what I'm doing. So I'm much older than all of you, so this is the early 80s, so I'm just buying Porsches and Cadillacs, and I'm flipping them at college. And so one Friday night, we're going to go visit some buddies at San Diego State. So I go to the grocery store to cash a check because we don't have ATMs. And the day before the lottery started in California. So I bought a ticket, and I won the lottery. True story. $5,000. That's the most you could win when it started. But put yourself in my place. You're 18. I think it's 1984. You just won $5,000. It's Friday night, and you're 10 minutes away from Tijuana. Okay. So I came back. You know what I did with my money? I took my folks to a nice restaurant, gave my brother and sister each $100, and I took the majority of the rest of the money, and I bought one stock because I believed in taking risk. And it was the 80s. I did pretty well. So the end of the next semester, I told my folks I wasn't going back to school. I took my money out of the market. I refinanced the current cars I was selling. I have like $20,000 now. And I went to buy a franchise. But no one will sell a 19-year-old a franchise. So what I did was I went and opened my own deli. It was like Subway before Subways. My whole business model was to sell out every day. Now, I never really sold out. I had this fresh baked bread. But it was the image, right? So you had to get there early, so there was always a line. It was the lunch rush, right? And there's 3 lessons I learned if you ever have a small business. You're the first one to work, you're the last one to leave, and you're the last one to be paid. It was very rewarding. And the first thing I learned when you go to small business, you think it's all going to be easy. No. There's regulations in everything that you do. I still remember this one morning. The front of my business was all glass, right? And I had like 5 or 6 people that would come and work for me in the morning. We'd chop up all the food and everything. And out front was this little pickup pulled up, and it was like 2 hours before I opened, and they're knocking at the door. And I look out, and it's a pickup truck, and it has the seal of the city. I'm thinking, I bet they want to give me a key to the city, right? You know, how many 19-year-olds have? The guy wanted to give me a ticket for my son. I said, I don't understand. You know, I went beyond, and he was supposed to get a permit for these 7. What did I know? I just put a sign out there to get more people to come eat there, right? So I asked the guy, so your job is to drive around and give me a ticket. I put a sign out to have more people come in, to buy more sandwiches, that pays more sales tax, that pays his salary to harass me to do it. You know, there's always challenges of what you do. But I've always believed I'm an entrepreneur. I believe I'm still an entrepreneur today. And how are we able to do it? But the one thing, if you look at America today, do you realize entrepreneurship's at its 17-year low? Interesting fact. You know, the Conservative Reform Network gave this fact that I thought, I didn't know it was true. I had to second guess it. More businesses fail in America every year than start. If you draw that out, we're in a really bad place. So what is the challenge? Not everyone's going to go win a lottery. Not everyone's going to go take a risk. And does it have to be something totally brand new? I met a friend one day, and he happens to be in venture capital, and he will only invest in things that's been around 100 years. Right? You ever buy one of those pens? You ever seen a pen where it would record what you say when you write, and then you hit Spanish, and it'll report back, you draw piano keys, and it'll play the piano? When was the last time a pen was invented, right? Or he invests in a new light bulb. Or he was early in a Tesla. And his whole thought was, why do you go into a new automobile company? How tough is that to entrance to market? You think, that'd be impossible. He said, well, the gas mileage at that time was about equal to what the Model A had at the same time, too. So innovation makes the world better. But entrance to market. Because one thing that happens, I find in Washington, regulation holds a lot of people back, but you know who likes regulation? Big companies. Because it takes away competition. When I entered my small deli, I thought no big deal. I found out all the other restaurants didn't want me to enter, right? It was competition. But it found out I made the customer better. You made a greater choice. You made a better opportunity. So I'm somebody who always believes in metrics. And I know today we're supposed to talk about where we're going to go and how we're going to do this. I first want to see the metric of Congress. Because we can all put the biggest ideas we want out there, but is Washington capable of doing it? I know they're capable of doing that slow creep where they can totally raise more regulations. Well, pretty soon you don't realize it's so tough to enter the market. Well, if we're at a 17-year low, we've made that big creep. So you can't do a slow creep back. You've got to do a fundamental change. So there's a couple of big ideas that I think could happen. But if I measure this new Congress, I just gave these statistics. And I gave them out at a little press conference the other day, and I gave them out today, and no one's written about it, so I'm going to keep giving it till somebody writes it, okay? Any of you know who Nate Silver is? Okay, Nate Silver, I like the guy. I believe he's not my same philosophy, but I'd go have lunch with him, right? Because first he followed baseball, but numbers don't lie, right? You can have every dream you want, but knowing the numbers is very important. But Nate Silver has this quote where he says, "The signal is the truth, and the noise is what distracts us from the truth." And the noise is what people write about in the middle of the day, and that distracts you. So why you want data is you want to know where the truth is. Don't let everything else distract you. So don't let people distract you, say you can't do it. You know, they told me I couldn't open my business. They told me I couldn't do it. I actually built the counter in my dad's garage, and I wasn't a woodworker. I was just determined I was going to get my business open. Okay, so what is the signal that you're seeing inside Congress today? Because there's some things you want to have happen if you're going to be able to make big change. You want it to be more accountable. You want it to be more open. That's what technology does. Technology brings more openness, more transparency. So first of all, if we're more accountable, if you measure Congress at the last 30-year history, only 7.1% of any bill gets out of the committee. And you want bills to come out of committee because that's where expertise come, where they have an understanding and a knowledge. You know, today we're at 10.1, so we're a much higher level than average. So you see, this is just in the first 7 months, so we're more productive. Well, but is Congress open that you're having debates on both sides? So you want to look at the number of amendments that have been offered. Do you realize in this new Congress, we're 200 amendments over the average of what's been allowed to be on the floor in the past? So now you have a much more open Congress, so you're having a better debate. There we go. Now, what about effectiveness of being able to pass bills? Well, we're much higher. 125 bills are normal, which have been passed in the last 25 years here. We're at 190. Now, how about, and I'll take it more from a partisan level, just measure the Republican that have been in the majority. Do you realize this is the second most effective Republican Congress in modern history? If you measure a bill based upon if it got passed and signed into law, we don't have a Republican president. The only one that's been greater than this is the 108th Congress, but they had a Republican president and they signed 10 more bills into law at this time as others. Now, I'm not saying we're perfect, but I'm saying we're trending in the right factor. So, are these ideas to make entrepreneurship greater, have a capability? Yes, because we have openness. And if there's one place you got to have more entrepreneurship, I'd say in the House and the Senate. Why? Because we've watched change happen so greatly across the country, but inside government it happens much slower. Why? Because they don't want to fight it. So if you ever want to see a way to do entrepreneurship, you know how I got all these statistics? A lot of young guys created a company called Quorum, and I contracted with them. You know what Quorum does? It just takes all the votes, all the congressional records, and it supplies it all and puts a little platform to it where I can pull it up in any shape or form I want. So now I have data. And data now lets me read it, so I have a better history of what I know can pass. If there's one place that I want to make a fundamental change that I think will help all small business, happens in all of our agencies. You know, when the country was created, we were three co-equal branches. But today, we're not co-equal. And I can't believe I can shift it in a moment. But what has happened if you envision creating the country today, would our agencies look like they do today? On the floor, we're going to vote on something called the REINS Act. You might think that's no big deal. But if you want to start a company, it's probably one of the biggest deals of whether you can enter the market. This is all that the RAIN Act does. It takes all the agencies and it says, if you're going to create a new regulatory that will go on to business, it gets scored, meaning what does it cost? If it reaches $100 million, it's called a major ruling. Well, do you have any say in whether that becomes in effect? Because it doesn't go to Congress, it doesn't go to Senate, so the RAINS Act simply says you should be co-equal. The people should have a voice, and where their voice, they lend it to the members of Congress. So if it is a major ruling that it's going to cost business $100 million, it should be voted on by the House and the Senate. So at least helps you get a level playing field. The other thing that I want to have happen, we'll vote on that one, so that one's going to go through. But I would like to redesign our agencies with this premise in mind. They need to be accountable, they need to be effective, and they need to be efficient. Does anybody in either party disagree with that? Okay. Why do we have all the duplication and the others? In the early 90s, something fundamentally changed in the world. The Soviet Union collapsed. So what did we do? We decided we're going to have to transform our military because it was all designed in the idea of having a Cold War and a battle with the Soviet Union, so the world had shifted. So we created what was called a BRAC, a base realignment and closure. Now you could never go in and just pinpoint one base or pinpoint one duplication. So what we did was we put a commission together and we'd look at everything and readjust. So some things got closed, some things got moved, duplication got taken out, and then you put it before Congress with one vote. What if we created a BRAC for our agencies? So you'd eliminate the duplication. You'd modernize where it needs to go. You could collect the data of what's happening. If you want to transform the ability to start new businesses, that'd be the first place. Because what would happen in the instance, agencies should be created to spur entrepreneurship, to solve the problems of where you go, not to hinder it. Because the more major rulings they put out only guarantees those that have already made it are going to have no more competition, and we will fall behind. So those two major factors, I firmly believe, give us an opportunity. And looking at where the Congress is going right now, I think we have a real chance of getting it done. So let me stop there, and I will take questions, but more importantly, I'll take advice because we're still at 8% approval. So what do you got for me? Come on, don't be shy. You think things are that great, really? Yeah. Usually the guys in the back are paid, they have to ask the questions. So.
Leader McCarthy, thank you so much for your stories about entrepreneurship. My question on the redesigning of agencies is, do you think you could turn that into a contest specifically directed towards millennials where a panel of judges could take the 10 best suggestions of how to redesign the federal government, turn it into bills maybe, and then have 100 student or millennial delegates debate that in the Ted Kennedy makeshift Senate next year so that they get a chance to hash it out as to why we have a federal government that simply isn't keeping up with the times?
I think that's a great question. I don't see why we could not. I'd go a step further. You know, any of you ever in debate, you know, you have one national question. Why don't we raise it as one national question in debate so every high school across the country would be debating it? But I'm a big believer in prizes. It encourages us. Look, fundamentally, America, in our heart, we're all entrepreneurs. That's why we went to space. That's why we conquered the West. That's why we even came across and came to America itself. I told you in my district, we also have aerospace. But it's not really NASA. It's all private space. So there's a report that just went out today about Richard Branson. Well, that happened inside my district. So if you want to go to space privately, you come to my district. But you know why it's in the district? Because of the X Prize. Because somebody put up $10 million if you could go to space twice within a month. And you know what? They won, but you know what it cost them? $30 million. But they're going to make more money now because someone was willing to take a risk. So if we put something out there and others are willing to take a risk with ideas, I think it could help transform where we go. Yes?
Congressman McCarthy, I'm in California, and I appreciate your leadership. A lot of the conversation today has been on
Thank you. A lot of the conversation today has been on deregulation and making a better environment for business. But what role does the federal government play in spurring innovation? You mentioned the colonization of the American West and the space program, which, as you know, there was significant federal support. So what can the federal government be doing now, aside from reforming its regulatory system, to spur the next great adventures?
Well, I think there's a lot of things the federal government can do. They could always set a foundation. You can get out of the way. You know, one of the biggest challenges to the space program privately, if the FAA wants to regulate it. And there's a role for the FAA. Other countries are trying this as well. So there's an ability to have an insurance. So you will take the risk, and if something happens, you'll be protected. Because if the risk is too great on an insurance size, you'll never go beyond that. So there is always a role for government. Look, I'm a conservative. I don't believe in no government. I just believe in limited government. And one of the greatest things we can do is don't punish people for failure. Encourage it, because you learn from it. I learned more from the races I lost than the races I won. Yes, sir. You look very familiar to me.
Good to see you again. Also, as California, earlier Senator Cornyn was here, and he spent a lot of time talking about how much better Texas is than California. And so I was kind of curious, what do you think, and I'm, as you know, I'm from San Diego, I'm Californian too. What do you think Texas and other parts of the country could actually learn about how California does things? I mean, other than build a light rail train across the entire state.
Do you know why Texas has improved from California? Because a lot of Californians have moved there. No, it's fundamentally true. One thing you should always learn, and it goes probably to your question, I have these basic philosophies in life. One is structure dictates behavior. Think about it. Where you sat is based upon the structure of where we sat, how we set up this room. Your behavior is based upon the structure. Now, why did a lot of Californians move to Texas? Do they have a better beach? No. Do they have a better mountain? No. They think they're a whole other country? Yes. But that's not why. Because in California, what California legislators believed is that California is so beautiful, you will stay there no matter what. But once the punishment went too high, you would depart. I'll give you a prime example. I'll give you a couple easy ones, right? Tiger Woods used to be a very good golfer, right? Tiger Woods grew up in California. He went to Stanford, but Tiger Woods lives in Florida. When did he move to Florida? The day he turned pro. Why? Because it mattered the amount of money that he was able to keep. The Williams sisters are unbelievable tennis players. They learned to play in the parks of California, but they don't live there anymore. You go to my own city. I have a individual that created a small business, technology, got pretty big. He loves Bakersfield. He loves California. He bought downtown. He loves everything about it, but he moved away, and he was in tears because he did not want to move. It's not like he had to go find another job. He literally moved his business when California raised their tax. This is an individual that his wife is so much involved in the community. She started a fund just to give money back for young women trying to get engaged. And you know what she told him, and he was sad to lose? The amount of more tax we'll pay, you'll be able to keep in Texas, but you could determine where that money goes instead of government, that it could be a greater effect. Do you know in California they get 25% of their entire budget from 144,000 people out of 39 million? The governor should know each and every one of those personally. But if you disproportionately, that's the outcome. So Texas is bragging about being successful. Yeah, they are smart because they keep a low rate. They make regulatory low. I mean, a good friend of mine is the CEO of Carl's Jr. He won't build another Carl's Jr. in California, but he'll build 50 more in Texas because of the time. He literally said it was easier to build a Carl's Jr. in Russia, I think it was on Lenin Way, than it was in Carl's Jr. on his name itself in California. So when you make the barrier too high, people will find another place to go. Now, other states have benefited from it because California people are very bright, that's why. So. Last question, yes.
Congressman Joel Gerke with National Review. You mentioned that it's difficult to reform, to make reforms in Washington. A lot of very small incremental things and problems build up that way, but it's difficult to do big changes. On your idea about sort of a BRAC commission for agencies, why in particular do you think that would work out here, given the difficulties that BRAC has had and the expectation, I suppose, that the executive branch wouldn't want to be pared down?
Well, if the executive branch doesn't want to be pared down, it's probably a very good sign they need to. So why don't you let the data determine it? Why doesn't the signal become the truth in that process? If you have it and you think of the structure inside the House and Senate, it would be too difficult to do things incrementally. So make it one vote up or one vote down. Today we're fighting a big battle in foreign policy around the world, but what's the structure we have to fight this battle? The same structure we set up really to fight the Soviet Union, right? Was NATO designed to battle ISIS or others? No. So that's why we need to, one, modernize and innovate where we go. And why do we have an agency? And I'll give you a prime example. We're dealing with the VA accountability this week. There's no one in this room that doesn't think the VA has severe problems. We've done everything we could to change it. We've changed the secretary. We've changed the rules. We've given them tremendous amount of more money, and the wait times are even longer. You find out, one of my favorite books is Good to Great. I think the best chapter in Good to Great is getting the right people on the bus. You've got to get the right people. Doesn't mean the very best, it's the right people to work together. Well, you know what happens in the VA system? You can't get rid of anybody. The structure does not allow you to do that. 85% of it is union. So even though one person has been fired in this process about that wait time, she didn't get fired because she didn't do the wait time right. She did something illegal somewhere else. But they couldn't even fire her for the incompetency. So you have a structure that's designed to be dysfunctional, and you get a dysfunctional outcome, and you wonder, why do I have to do it? Oh, it's government. We should put up with it. No. That's why I think it needs a fundamentally turning on its head to be able to go forward. And if you start with the premise, effective, efficient, and accountable, that's not a partisan. That's simply what I expect out of my government. And if you can't meet that criteria, there's not a need for it. The VA system was created when we'd write things on paper, or we didn't have air conditioning, we put on a fan. Radio is how we got our news. Well, you know what? We get our news differently today. We get air conditioning today, but the VA still goes with paper. Before we leave this week, we have to give the VA $3.3 billion more dollars. Now, they were before a committee less than a month ago, and they never mentioned that they were going to have a $3 billion deficit this year. But a week later, they come back to us and says, oh my God, we didn't realize this. So you ask the question, why didn't you realize this? Oh, we have 2 computer systems. You can't manage an organization like that? Well, the answer is not just to feed him more money, turn it upside on his head. And then I would sit back from an entrepreneur position. Why was the VA created? What was the goal? To provide health care for veterans. Well, what does the VA system do today? They spend their money on bricks and mortars. Is that the best place for them to spend their money, or is it on the care of the veterans? So why wouldn't you step back and say, well, why does a veteran in one community have to drive 200 miles to go down to a VA hospital and pass all those hospitals along the way, or those doctors? Wouldn't there be a better way that they'd have a greater choice, that they could go to care there, because you're reaching the goal of why the VA system was created, and I don't have to spend the billions on building. Why? Because the VA is trying to build a system inside Colorado where they've have overruns in money. They can't finish up building it. At the end of the day, they'll probably end up having to sell it. It's been dysfunctional. So how long do we have to accept a dysfunctional government? If you want entrepreneurs to spread, I think changing those things that are hurdles in front of its way are fundamental. And to me, one of those is government. Thank you for the opportunity.